Welcome to the Inside Scoop Live podcast, where indie authors get personal about their books, their writing, and their passions. I'm your host, Sherry Hoyt. Join me for some lively conversations with debut indie authors and seasoned veterans alike. It's a great place to find your next amazing read or even get inspired. So sit back and enjoy the show and let me know what you think. Hi, everyone. Today I'm talking with Syl Tang, author of Disrobed, a book about where the world is going through the lens of our wearables. Before we get started, here's the inside scoop on the author. Syl Tang has been a futurist for over 25 years with an eye towards world events such as natural disasters, geopolitical clashes, and economic cycles. In addition to her book Disrobed, she has written hundreds of articles on the confluence of world events and soft goods for print outlets such as the Financial Times, predicting and documenting occurrences such as the Trump election, the Apple Watch and other smart wearables, lab-made diamonds, and the effects of global warming on the South Seas. As CEO and founder of HipGuide Inc., her work has helped more than 50 companies and governments. In addition to helping them navigate the future, she is behind the launches of some of the most well-known beauty, beverage, automotive, and urban development efforts, including revitalizing Detroit and product category changers such as frozen alcohol and mineral makeup. In 1999, she created the first mobile lifestyle texting product in the market and predicted mobile couponing as it exists today. Her company HipGuide is a case study taught in universities around the world from Dubai to Nova Scotia to Purdue through a textbook series with McGraw-Hill. Her book Disrobed can be found at over 1,000 libraries, including Harvard, Oxford, Yale, and the New York Public Library, as well as at all major bookstores including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Waterstones, and Blackwell's. You can learn more about Syl Tang and connect with her at linktree-hipguide. Well, hi Syl, welcome to Inside Scoop Live.
Thank you so much. I'm super happy to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk with you about your book, Disrobed. Before we get started in that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am a futurist and have been for more than 20 years, maybe 25 years. And so futurism is actually an old industry. It's been around for many, many decades, probably nearly a century. But I think a lot of people are only recently hearing about it because it is a job that mainly consults to companies and governments at the highest levels on the inside. And so it's not a consumer-facing role, and a lot of people have not heard of it. But basically, I help companies and governments figure out where the world is going and how it's going to affect them.
Oh, wow. So what is Disrobed about? Tell us a little bit about the book and then kind of what inspired you to write it.
So Disrobe specifically is a snapshot of one piece of what I do. When I think about futurism and how to explain it to other people, you often want to make things that are accessible. So Disrobe happens to take one thing, which is clothing, and attach clothing to all the things that are happening in our world and help people have an understanding of where the world is going and how to make better sense of what's coming next. And it came about because I was writing a lot for the Financial Times. And when you write for a newspaper, often you get 800 to 1,000 words, but you don't get more. And many topics deserved what's called long form writing, 5,000 words, 10,000 words. You often don't have space for that. So I wanted to delve into a lot of topics a bit further.
Yeah. Before we talked, I had the opportunity to listen to the audio version of Disrobed, and wow. First of all, I love the audio delivery. The narrator did a fantastic job. And then I was surprised by so many aspects of the book, and so I'm eager to talk to you about that, about a few of those things anyway. But before we get into that, I wanted to let our listeners know that Disrobed participated in our most recent Literary Awards program, the 2022 Reviewers' Choice Awards. And Disrobed took home the gold medal in our classics category for societal issues. So first of all, congratulations on your award.
Thank you so much. I was so excited. I'm so excited that it has perennial interest. I think we call it evergreen interest because it's come out a while ago now. And it's still selling and people are still interested and there's still talks happening around it. I'm giving another one in May at the New School. And it's for, a book that's been out a while, I think that it's still capturing new eyes.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, all the issues that you talk about, they're still relevant today. Now, when I think of societal issues, my brain kind of just goes to issues like poverty and climate change and civil rights and, the big ones. So what does clothing have to do with society and societal issues?
Well, it really does in so many different ways. But let's just take one example. You look at what is happening now. Towards the very end of the book, I write about the burkini ban, and of course, when that was happening, it was really around this clash of civilizations happening between the East and the West, where the Middle East is facing this pushback in Europe regarding people being upset about face coverings and burqas and burkinis on their beaches. And now you see how that's turned into something, a clash that's taking place in Iran. So, the Iranian women who are so much in the news right now, it's really, clothing is, I think a lot of times people think about clothing as fashion, but it's more than that. It is representative of how we present ourselves to the world, what we think about ourselves. It touches on so many aspects of our lives. And right now, clothing in Iran and other places is an indication of how we feel about women, how we feel about politics, how we feel about the status quo. For many decades, clothing has been used to police women. There's every few years there's an issue around what women can wear in our various legislatures. There's always some issue around whether women are permitted to wear this. You're either too disrobed or too clothed or vice versa. There's some it comes up in lots of different ways that people wouldn't think.
Yeah. I heard something, well, I guess it's not really related. Well, it's kind of related to women's appearances in that the granddaughter of one lady who in elementary school was forced to cut her hair to kind of diminish her ethnicity,
Yes.
That's in the news today. So, I mean, that kind of all ties in.
Very much so. Very much so. Yes. And, it is how we appear is often used it signifies who we are to other people and can be used to diminish who we are. So you look at the whole thing that happened over the last few years with masks. It's a piece of cloth, but it's very political now. That has shifted so much. So at the beginning, in certain places, it was used to indicate that you respected others, and then vice versa, used to indicate that you were not, falling in line with some people who didn't want to wear masks. And so it has shifted. Even, I went to get on the train the other day, and there were not many people wearing masks, and the guy across from me was wearing a mask. And I happen to not be, and I am not an anti-masker. And I looked at him and he looked so uncomfortable with me. And I said, you know what? I have a mask in my pocket. I said to him, I have one. Would it make you more comfortable? And he looked so relieved. I was very shocked.
Wow.
It's really changed. So pieces of cloth that people think about as fashion has, says a lot to other people. It's the first thing that they see about you before you speak.
Yeah. Oh, I love that story about the mask because, I've been lax, I've been vaccinated a number of times and, most of the people that I hang around with have been as well. And, so we've gotten kind of lax, but it's still an issue.
And it will continue to be an issue because, it changes as people are at different stages, what they're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And I think there are still people yelling at people to take off their masks when, why are we policing what people do? So,
right.
if you want to wear a mask, you should be able to.
Exactly. I want to get into maybe a specific example from your book. How does something, because this chapter on cotton I found really intriguing. How does something seemingly innocent as just buying a $5 or $10 t-shirt, what kind of impact does that have on society?
Well, the $10 t-shirt comes from someplace. It is made of a physical product, whether that's cotton or synthetic or rayon, that has an entire series of industries behind it. Not just the farmers, the manufacturers, the whole delivery system, the process. So by the time the $10 t-shirt has reached you, you have touched on everything from the Amazon worker and how much they're being paid to get it to you, the department store, the whole life cycle of the item. But at the very, what that chapter is about really about famine. So what has taken place in various countries in terms of the farming. And, there's a lot of stuff that I don't touch on in the book in terms of various federal governments propping up other federal governments. Where does that money go? So there is a situation right now in the US regarding farms and their subsidies. So it's much more than just that one item. And that's true with, obviously, in my book, I only talk about clothing, but that's true with everything. How do the strawberries get to your table? What has happened in the industry that got you that strawberry and so forth? And obviously the water issues around farming and famine and how the land is used. So there are many layers before that one item gets to your doorstep.
Yeah, yeah. And things that I never would have even considered, which that's what your whole book does. It has some shock value to it.
Well, I want people to think about what happened to that item. I just think it's quite challenging to feel so responsible to carry the weight of your shoulder of, all the things that happened before you got that $10 t-shirt.
Right.
And to think about where it came from. You can't possibly, I think there is a lot of conversation around sustainable sourcing and responsible sourcing. And now there's even a politics around getting away from that. But the truth of the matter is, as the consumer, it's very difficult for you to track it to that origin. You can't possibly find out if, and this is the truth, and I know a lot of people don't like when I say this, but it is the truth. You cannot find out all the steps that happened to that item before you got it. It's impossible. You could try, but first of all, the average consumer is not going to sit there and try to do that. And it would be impossible. You'd spend all day trying to track it all the way to that first person who touched it. It's not possible. There are too many tentacles. But I do think it's an interesting conversation to have, to think about how we got our things and to try to make more responsible choices and think about our impact on the planet. Ultimately, I think it's realizing that there's that old cliche saying, no man is an island, to feel that we are responsible for more than just ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, there are so many topics in your book that we can't possibly cover. Even though your book is only 120 pages, I'm so impressed in how you packed so much information into this. It must be your newspaper experience.
There was some criticism of that. Some people didn't like that there were so many topics that seemed to sort of blade over the surface and then kind of keep going.
Oh, no, I thought it was just the right amount because it wasn't information overload. And then, for people that wanted to dive deeper, you have plenty of, citations. And yeah, absolutely. But I think what I liked most about your book is that you shared all of this knowledge through relatable stories rather than just the regurgitation of facts. And I laughed out loud at some of those stories, particular like the bankers' wives. And
oh yeah,
oh my goodness, oh that was hilarious.
Yes.
I mean, very creative. But I was wondering if you had a favorite story that you kind of uncovered while writing this book that you could share with us real quick.
Well, I didn't really get to include it. There was originally supposed to be another chapter at the very end.
Oh.
And I think, right. So one of the things that I think readers don't realize when they pick up a book is that when a publishing house chooses you and an editor chooses you, you really have to make sure you're synergistic with the person who's going to edit your book. And you have to make sure that you and that house want the exact same thing. And I think one of the things that Rowman and Littlefield really wanted, which I understood, is they wanted to make sure the book ended on a positive note. They wanted to make sure that it was more, and if you ever meet me in person, sometimes people say, do you have any hope at all? Because I have a lot of things to say about driverless cars and artificial intelligence and surveillance that aren't that positive, really.
Yeah.
But the last chapter that I was going to write that did not make the cut was actually about Trump winning the election and about and I knew that was coming before it came, and I'm not the only one, and about where that was going and where the state of politics is going right now. And I do think things are going to get worse before they get better, if they get better. And they didn't want me to include that. So I think the most interesting thing was, and obviously this is, when I was writing the books, actually 2016 before the election. So I was writing about all the things that are in fact happening now. And that ultimately is something maybe I'll do a TED talk about it, or another piece about it. But I had some things to say that people were not crazy about, and they felt they were out there.
Well, I would like to read that chapter.
Well, I
Yeah.
think that some of the things step on topics that people are quite sensitive about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
which I'm okay with, but obviously they're a lightning rod for debate and anger and
Right.
controversy.
Well, yeah, and when you're publishing a book, you want to appeal to as many people as you can.
Yeah, I don't think Roman Littlefield was afraid of upsetting people as much as they were concerned that they wanted to leave people with hope.
Yeah.
And I think that makes sense. At the end of a book, you want to feel as though you learn something, but also you have something that you can do next. So you don't feel hopeless about what's coming.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Disrobe has been out for a while. It came out in
Yeah.
2017. So, have there been any significant changes to the world as it relates to clothing
Oh,
since then?
so many, so many. I mean, I wouldn't say it's necessarily around clothing. There are changes to clothing, but I think a lot of the topics that I start to touch on in the book have gone, if it's a spectrum, have gone now to further steps. So, for example, I talk about artificial intelligence and driverless cars, and you really see with the chatbots that are coming out now, and that whole world has evolved into something that people are really talking about, and its potential impacts on teaching, on science, on what is truth, on journalism. But I think that, so here's an example. I talk a little bit in the chapter about that kind of technology and the target example of the teenager being outed to her family being pregnant. And after the book came out, there was an incident where Palantir, the technology company, used that technology to survey and round up immigrants.
Mm,
And so a lot of those things, I talk about the burqas, and that had turned into the whole mask controversy and is now evolved into something much further beyond that. So all of those topics have become bigger, or have evolved into full blown situations.
right.
Early in the day, when I was writing the book, people were talking about the cyclical economy, the circular economy. And I think that is a much bigger industry than it was in 2016. And the life cycle of a t-shirt now has a whole trajectory that it didn't used to. It will now make it into some stall in India and then get sold back to you here in the US. And there's those industries have really evolved into something bigger.
Yeah. I think about Amazon influencers too, and
Yes.
their involvement in the clothing industry now. It's like,
It'll be interesting to see how long that's sustainable, because of course every industry, so I saw something in the news today that the CDs are now 40 years old.
oh my
So
gosh.
I know. It's everything that you thought was just yesterday is now vintage. So it'll be interesting to see. I think Instagram, for example, is now trying to charge people for the verification. And
Mm,
so it will be interesting to see which companies exist 5, 10 years from now and what that evolution looks like.
yeah.
And it won't be this one. It won't be these influencer programs.
One thing our reviewer mentioned was that she would be interested in knowing what you have to think about other issues like the plus size movement, or how certain items of clothing are labeled as either masculine or feminine, and wearing the wrong gender's clothing can be licensed for others to abuse and ridicule us. Do you have any opinions on those issues?
Well, let's take each one, right? The gender issue is very interesting, because right now you see these legislations around drag queens. And I'm a little fascinated by that, because if you really look at history, drag queens and drag has been around forever. It
Yes.
was, back in war times, men used to dress up in drag to entertain each other in theater. Drag has existed in movies like Tootsie, Mrs. Doubtfire. It's not new. Drag,
Shakespeare. Yeah.
Shakespeare, women weren't allowed to be actors, so men used to dress up as women. And now it's being used to be this political statement. But really, the legislation is around other things. You see the states that are trying to ban drag shows want to also ban talk about women's periods. They want to change what we can teach in schools. There are other tentacles that really have nothing to do with clothing. So you see this bifurcation now that's quite extreme, with some people going one direction and the other people going very, really the other direction. There was a protest where some neo-Nazis came out to I guess there was a library or a public park that hosted a drag story hour for kids. And the neo-Nazis were chanting some very violent things, and they started to follow families home. They followed families and kids home, and they had guns. So you see this very extreme situation now where gender and gendered clothing is not really about clothing. It's really a byword for other behaviors and other feelings and potentially other legislation that's coming down.
Mm-hmm. A lot of control issues.
A lot of control issues, a lot of wanting people to conform to societal models that have been outdated for a long time. And it's not really about, if you look at the history of drag, it isn't really about that. It's not really about whether men can wear women's clothing.
Right.
And, the plus size issue is a whole other ball of wax, because I think even though women have fought long and hard for clothing to be inclusive, the fashion industry really hasn't paid attention to it. There are very few brands that have really said, look, we really mean it when we're inclusive. We're really going to go up to 4X, 5X. They really don't. They just don't. Sizes are still something like 0 to maybe 10 or 12, if you're lucky. Mm-hmm. I am not, as it happens, I'm not a large person, and I'm a large in a lot of brands. That says a lot to me.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah.
The industry has not evolved the way it should be. And I think that there are also tangential issues around that, because it discriminates, quite frankly, against women of color. So, traditionally, women of color are discriminated and left out of the fashion industry. And when you don't have inclusive clothing, it also discriminates against people who are differently abled. Mm-hmm. And there was a brand that I recently saw that came out of the UK that makes clothing for people who are shorter, who are, I think, around 4 feet in stature or shorter. And obviously I was surprised to see that there has not been a greater embrace of people who are, say, in wheelchairs, or, who need clothing for various disabilities, or there's just not that much out there.
Wow. There are just so many different angles to consider. Like, what does this person confined to a wheelchair need? What does,
And there are a lot of people who would purchase that clothing. So I went onto that website and everything was sold out.
Wow.
For obvious reasons, because there's demand for it. And the prices they weren't Target or Walmart prices either. And so if the clothing industry were just a little bit more open-minded, they would find a lot more consumers.
Mm-hmm. Writing this book, Disrobed, and the full title, I don't think I mentioned earlier, but Disrobed, How Clothing Predicts Economic Cycles, Saves Lives, and Determines the Future. What do you hope readers take away from reading your book? What is the most important issue to you?
I think the most important issue is to realize that, and this is maybe greater than the than the remit of the book or the attempt of the book, but we have this thing happening in society now where you've got some segments of the population very concerned about what happens to others, and you've got some segments of the population that just don't care. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the greatest cons in the US is this idea that if you pick yourselves up by your bootstraps, the American dream, you don't need anybody else, you could do it yourself. And I don't think that that's true. I think that when we are born, we are helpless. And frequently when we pass away, we are helpless at the beginning and the end of our lives. Mm-hmm. And even though the book is ostensibly about clothing, originally when I went out with the book to publishers, it was actually a much broader book. I wanted to tackle all of these issues and how they were interconnected to each other. And I was basically told I'd bitten off more than I could chew. And I think that's correct. I think it was too much of a book. But I would like people to realize that what they do affects others. And that's both positive and negative. They can affect others so they can affect change and not feel as though they're so helpless that their vote does make a difference. You can make a difference in other people's lives. It doesn't have to be millions. You can make a difference in 2 people's lives, and that counts for something. Mm-hmm. So I want people to realize that no man is an island.
Absolutely.
I want them to go out and do more.
Well, it sounds like you have a lot more to say. Will there be another book in your future?
I'm not sure. As Dorothy Parker said, I like having written versus writing. I'm actually working on something very different. I'm working on a TED Talk about medicine and aging, similar to what I've done with Disrobed, but I'm tackling a topic that other people haven't really tackled in the way that I want to tackle it. I think we spend slightly too much time fighting aging.
Yeah, and it happens no matter what.
Yeah, so I'm working on a TED Talk about medicine.
Oh, okay. Well, that'll be interesting. You'll have to keep me posted on that. Yeah.
Well, I'll let you know. It's not there yet. I want to be responsible and attach my unique way of connecting different threads, but not confusing people.
Yeah. Well, Syl, did you have anything else you wanted to add today?
No, thank you so much for interviewing me. And thank you so much for shining a light on the book and keeping interest going.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure having you here, and I really enjoyed listening to your book. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you so much, Sherry.
Thank you for joining me today for my interview with Syl Tang, author of Disrobed. You can learn more about Syl and connect with her at linktree-HipGuide. And be sure and check out our other interviews at InsideScoopLive.com.